What would you do if you discovered that the love of your life had been waiting for you for 58 years? A moving story about destiny, regret, and the courage to give love a second chance. The afternoon sun filtered lazily through the windows of Sunset Grove, an elegant nursing home in Newport, Rhode Island. Sarah Miller climbed the stairs to the third floor, her footsteps echoing down the silent corridor, marking her 5th month of volunteer work at the facility. That Thursday afternoon seemed like any other, until it wasn't. Sarah knocked softly on room 307, where Mr. William Thompson, one of the home's most reserved residents, lived. Getting no response, she entered quietly. He was probably at his physiotherapy session. The room was immaculate, reflecting the military life William had led decades ago. Sarah began her usual organizing routine, but something caught her attention. A chair out of place, revealing a small opening in the wall's baseboard. Intrigued, she approached and discovered an old wooden box, covered by a thin layer of dust. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the box. The aroma of aged paper filled the air, and her eyes widened at the sight of dozens of yellowed envelopes, all addressed to the same person. Eleanor Hayes, 42, Maple Street, Newport, Rhode Island. None of them had been sent. "What do you think you're doing?" The unexpected deep voice made Sarah jump, dropping some of the letters on the floor. William stood at the door, leaning on his cane, his usually serene face now marked by a mixture of anger and fear. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry," Sarah began, gathering the letters hastily, her face burning with shame. "Leave them." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying an emotion Sarah had never witnessed in the always controlled Mr. Thompson. But something in the way his hands trembled as he approached the box, in the moist gleam that appeared in his faded blue eyes, made Sarah stay where she was. "These letters, they're all for the same person. Eleanor." William leaned heavily on the edge of the bed, his shoulders dropping as if carrying the weight of all those unspoken words. "Eleanor," he whispered the name like a long-forgotten prayer. "I haven't heard that name in 58 years. Sarah observed a subtle transformation in William's face. The deep wrinkles seemed to soften for a moment, as if the simple act of pronouncing that name transported him back in time. "Why were they never sent?" Sarah asked softly, holding one of the letters delicately. William remained silent for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with regret. "Because some stories, Miss Miller, are too painful to revisit." He extended his trembling hand for the box. "Please leave the past where it belongs." But as Sarah began returning the letters to the box, a photograph slipped from inside one of the envelopes. It was a stunning young woman, with dark wavy hair and a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire image, even after so many decades. On the back, a single handwritten line, "To William, because some summers are eternal. With love, Eleanor." The sound that escaped William's lips, something between a sigh and a contained sob, made Sarah realize she had stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple box of old letters. It was a love story that had never really ended. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "I think maybe, some stories need to be revisited. Not to stay in the past, but to have a chance at a future." William let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Chance at a future? My dear, look at me. I'm just an old man with regrets. Eleanor probably moved on with her life, got married, had children if she's still. You know," his voice failed. "Besides, even if I wanted to find her, I wouldn't know where to begin. Newport has changed so much in the last decades." Sarah moved closer, sitting beside him on the bed. "Mr. Thompson, you once told me you were military, right? And soldiers never give up on a mission." She picked up Eleanor's photo, studying the details. "Besides, true love has a peculiar way of finding its path. If you'll let me, I can help you find her." William's eyes met hers, And for the first time since Sarah had known him, she saw something different in them, a small spark of hope fighting against decades of resignation. In the days that followed, Sarah noticed a subtle change in William. The reserved man who rarely spoke about himself now seemed to carry a lighter weight on his shoulders, as if the discovery of the letters had unlocked something in his heart. On a particularly quiet afternoon, while the rain softly pattered against the window of room 307, William finally began to tell his story. It was the summer of 1965. His voice took on a distant tone, eyes fixed on the rain outside, but seeing something far beyond. I had just graduated from military academy and was on leave in Newport before my first mission. Eleanor. He smiled as he pronounced the name. She worked at the municipal library. William closed his eyes, letting the memories flow. I saw her for the first time between the classic literature shelves. She was trying to reach a book on the highest shelf, Wuthering Heights. I offered help, and when our eyes met, he paused, lost in the memory. Well, you're young. You must know that feeling when the whole world stops for a moment. Sarah observed how William's hands, usually trembling, became steady as he held Eleanor's old photograph. We spent every free moment of that summer together. Eleanor had a unique way of seeing the world. She found beauty in the smallest things. She taught me to appreciate poetry, introduced me to music I'd never heard. And he chuckled softly. I tried to impress her with my military training stories and my plans for the future. But then his expression changed, a shadow crossing his face. At the end of August, I received my mission orders. I would be sent to an overseas base for an indefinite period. On our last night together, we made plans. She promised to wait for me, and I promised to return. William stood up with difficulty, walking to the window. But then, 3 months later, I received a letter from my sister. She mentioned seeing Eleanor with a young local doctor, appearing very close. My sister probably didn't realize what she was doing by telling me that, but he shook his head. I was too young and proud. Instead of asking Eleanor directly, I started writing these letters. Each one carried all the love and pain I felt, but I never had the courage to send them. You never tried to discover the truth? Sarah asked softly. William turned to her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. When I finally returned to Newport, 2 years later, she had moved away. Nobody could tell me where. Or perhaps, he hesitated, perhaps I didn't search hard enough, afraid of what I might discover. Much later, I learned that the doctor was actually her cousin, who was visiting the city. And the letters? I continued writing for years, even after getting married. A marriage that lasted only 5 years, even after retiring from the Army. It was my way of keeping alive the only time in my life when I truly loved someone. William picked up one of the letters, his fingers delicately tracing Eleanor's name on the envelope. Funny how fate works, isn't it? I spent decades hiding these letters, and you find them by chance. Sarah observed the man before her, no longer the reserved Mr. Thompson, but William, a young man in love trapped in an elderly body. An idea began to form in her mind. Mr. Thompson, she began cautiously. What if it wasn't too late? Before William could respond, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. A tall young man, about 30 years old, entered the room, carrying a leather briefcase. "Grandpa?" he called, stopping when he noticed the emotional atmosphere in the room. "Oh, sorry. I didn't know you had company." William quickly wiped his eyes. "James, my grandson." He gestured towards Sarah. "This is Sarah Miller, one of the volunteers." What none of them could imagine at that moment was how this casual encounter would change their lives forever. In the days following the meeting in William's room, Sarah couldn't get the story of the letters out of her head. Her routine at the nursing home remained the same, but now she carried with her the weight of a secret that could change someone's life. To her surprise, James returned to the nursing home the next day, and the next and the next, always with his worn leather briefcase and a curious look when he found her in the hallway. On the third day, he approached her in the cafeteria. So he began, sitting across from her with a cup of coffee. "You found my grandfather's letters." Sarah straightened in her chair, suddenly feeling defensive. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "Hey, easy." James raised his hands in a placating gesture, a gentle smile on his face. "I'm not here to scold you." Actually, he lowered his voice, leaning forward. "I've never seen my grandfather so alive as in these past few days. It's as if something awakened inside him." Sarah relaxed a bit, studying the young man before her. James had the same piercing blue eyes as his grandfather, but there was a different intensity in them, that of someone who observed the world looking for stories to tell. "Did you know about Eleanor?" she asked. James shook his head. "Had no idea. My grandfather was always reserved. After my grandmother passed away, 15 years ago, he became even more withdrawn. Now I understand that perhaps that wasn't his only lost love." Sarah bit her lip, hesitant. "I've been thinking, what if we could find her?" James's eyes lit up. "I was hoping you'd say that. I brought something to show you." He opened his briefcase, pulling out a laptop. "I've spent the last few nights researching. Eleanor Hayes, King's College, London, 1960s. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he spoke. "And I found this." On the screen, an old graduation photo. Among the smiling faces, there she was. Eleanor Hayes, older than in the photo William kept, but with the same luminous smile. "This is," Sarah began, excited. 1968, James completed. "She graduated in English literature. And there's more." He clicked on another tab. "Eleanor Hayes became a university professor. She taught at Oxford for 3 decades. Retired in 2005. Sarah felt her heart race. "Did you manage to find anything more recent?" James's smile dimmed slightly. "That's where things get complicated. After 2005, the records become unclear. I found mentions of her in Brighton, then in Edinburgh, but nothing concrete." "But it's a start," Sarah exclaimed, her mind already working through the possibilities. "We could contact the universities, look through local records." "Sarah," James interrupted gently, "we need to be realistic. Even if we find her, almost 6 decades have passed. What if she's married? What if she doesn't want to revisit the past? What if she's been waiting for this as much as your grandfather has?" Sarah countered. "You're a writer, James. You must believe in the power of unfinished stories." He observed her for a moment, a different smile appearing on his face. "You know, when I started writing my last book, it was about coincidences, how small moments can completely change the course of our lives. Maybe," he hesitated, "maybe this isn't just about my grandfather and Eleanor. Maybe it's about all of us believing it's never too late." Sarah felt her cheeks flush under James's intense gaze. But before she could respond, her phone vibrated. It was a message from her supervisor at the nursing home. William had experienced a minor health scare and was asking for her. In the next few minutes, as they rushed to room 307, Sarah and James didn't notice how their steps naturally synchronized, how their hands brushed lightly as they turned the corner, or how their hearts beat at the same accelerated rhythm. Not just from concern for William, but from something new and unexpected beginning to bloom between them. When they reached the room, they found William sitting in his armchair, pale but conscious, holding one of the old letters. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice trembling. "Something I've never told anyone about my last encounter with Eleanor." What William would reveal would completely change the course of their search, but at that moment, all Sarah and James could do was exchange a worried look and sit down to hear another chapter of this story that seemed far from over. William took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he held the letter. "That last night, Eleanor gave me an envelope, made me promise to open it only when I reached the base." His voice cracked. "I never opened it." Sarah and James exchanged perplexed looks. "Never?" James asked, leaning forward in his chair. "The envelope is here," William continued, pulling out a yellowed envelope from the box, still sealed, different from the other letters. "For decades, I convinced myself it contained a farewell, a confirmation that she would move on with someone else. But now he extended the envelope to Sarah. "I think it's time to know the truth." With trembling fingers, Sarah carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a small newspaper clipping from 1965. She began reading aloud. "My dearest William, by the time you read this, you'll be on your way to your mission. There's something I need to tell you, something that will change our lives forever. I've been accepted to Oxford, not just King's College. A full scholarship, a dream I never thought possible. But that's not all." Sarah paused, her eyes widening as she read the next lines. "Continue," William whispered. "I decided not to accept. Not yet. I deferred the scholarship for a year, William, because there's something more important than London, than Oxford, than any dream I've ever had. You, us. What we built this summer is too real to let slip away. I'll be here when you return. A year, 10 years, however long it takes. Because some stories can't remain unfinished. With eternal love, Eleanor." The silence that followed was deafening. James was the first to notice the newspaper clipping that had fallen to the floor. It was a small announcement from the social section. "Eleanor Hayes delays Oxford studies. Promising Newport youth surprises academic community with personal decision." "My God," William murmured, tears flowing freely down his face. All this time— "Wait," Sarah interrupted, her eyes running over the letter again. "There's more here at the bottom. P.S. If something goes wrong, if we lose each other, look for me at Blackwell's bookshop in Oxford. It was my dream to work there, and I promise that, no matter how much time passes, I'll leave clues about my whereabouts with them." James was already on his laptop, typing furiously. "Blackwell still exists. It's one of Oxford's oldest bookshops." He continued searching, his eyes scanning the screen rapidly. "Wait, this is interesting. There's an Eleanor Hayes listed as emeritus curator of the rare book section." And he stopped, his face paling. "What is it?" Sarah and William asked in unison. "She gave a lecture there 3 weeks ago about lost loves in classical literature." William tried to stand, his legs shaky. Sarah and James rushed to support him. "She never married." James continued reading, his voice barely containing the emotion. "Built a brilliant career, traveled the world giving lectures on literature, but according to this short biography, she always returns to Oxford. The most incredible thing," he swallowed hard, "she still maintains a peculiar ritual. She keeps quotes from her favorite books in a blue glass bottle, which she keeps on her desk in the bookshop." William closed his eyes, a distant memory hitting him. "She used to say that some stories are like bottles at sea, they always find their way back to shore." Sarah grabbed her phone, her hands trembling with excitement. "I'll call the bookshop right now." "No," William interrupted, a new determination in his voice. "If we're going to do this, it needs to be in person. I owe her that. I owe us that." "But Grandpa, your health," James began, concerned. "I'm 78 years old, James. I've spent 58 of them regretting not opening a letter. I won't spend another day regretting not having tried." Sarah observed the two men before her, grandfather and grandson, both writers of different stories, united by a love that transcended time. An idea began to form in her mind. "The Oxford Literary Festival starts next week," she said, showing something on her phone. "And guess who's one of the main speakers?" On the screen, a recent photo of Eleanor Hayes, her hair now silver, but her eyes still shining with the same intensity as in the old photo. The title of the lecture made everyone's hearts race. Unsent Letters, the Power of Unspoken Words. Destiny, it seemed, had perfect timing. "I'll buy 3 tickets to London," James announced, already reaching for his phone. "First class," he added, looking at his grandfather with a smile. That night, as Sarah drove home, she couldn't stop thinking about how her life had changed in just a few days. In her rearview mirror, she could see the full moon illuminating Newport, the same moon that had witnessed William and Eleanor's love so many years ago. Her phone vibrated with a message from James. "Tickets purchased. You were right. It's never too late to believe in happy endings. Sarah smiled, thinking about how sometimes you need to help rewrite other people's love stories to find the courage to start your own. The Oxford Literary Festival was in full swing when the three arrived in the historic city. Blackwell's, with its imposing Victorian facade, was decorated with banners and posters announcing the week's events. Eleanor Hayes's name appeared prominently in tomorrow's program. William barely slept that night. In his hotel room, he reread the letter Eleanor had written 58 years ago, each word now engraved in his heart. In the room next door, Sarah was also awake, exchanging messages with James, who was upstairs with his grandfather. "Is he nervous?" she typed. "More than the day he received his first military mission," James replied. After a pause, he added, "Sarah, thank you for not putting those letters back in the box that day." Sarah smiled at her phone, her heart racing in a way that was becoming familiar whenever she thought of James. Morning arrived with England's typical timid sun. Eleanor's lecture was scheduled for 11 a.m. in the bookstore's main auditorium. William, impeccable in his navy blue suit, sat between Sarah and James in the third row. When Eleanor took the stage, time seemed to freeze. At 76, she still carried that elegance William had described so many times. Her silver hair was arranged in an elaborate bun, and she wore an ensemble in shades of blue that made her eyes sparkle. "The power of unspoken words," she began, her clear, melodious voice filling the auditorium. "Sometimes, it's the letters we never send that tell our truest stories." William squeezed James's hand tightly. Sarah noticed he was silently moving his lips, following each of Eleanor's words as if he knew them by heart. 58 years ago, Eleanor continued, "I learned that some loves are like unfinished books. We keep turning empty pages, waiting for an ending we never write." That's when she opened her bag and pulled out something that made William catch his breath. A blue glass bottle, identical to the one he had described so many times. "In this bottle," she showed the audience, "I keep quotes that mark my life. But the first one, the one I never had the courage to remove, is from a letter I never sent." Her hands trembled slightly as she unrolled a small yellowed piece of paper. "To William, because some summers are eternal." William stood up before Sarah or James could stop him. In the silence that followed, his voice rang clear and firm. "With love, Eleanor." The entire auditorium turned to him. Eleanor dropped the bottle, the blue glass rolling across the stage without breaking. Her eyes met William's, and in that moment, 5 decades dissolved like mist in the sun. "William?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unsent letters. "You waited," he said, tears streaming down his face. "You came," she replied, her own eyes brimming with tears. The audience watched in absolute silence as Eleanor descended from the stage with trembling steps. William walked to the center aisle, James and Sarah right behind him, ready to help if needed. When they finally stood face to face, Eleanor raised her hand, touching William's face gently, as if checking if he was real. "You still have the same eyes," she murmured. "And you still find beauty in the smallest things," he responded, holding her hand against his face. "I have all your letters," William continued, his voice breaking. "Every single one. Never sent, but written with all the love I never stopped feeling." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "And I have 58 years of quotes in blue bottles, all chosen thinking of you." Sarah felt James's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. They watched in silence as William and Eleanor embraced, decades of longing dissolving into a moment of pure happiness. The auditorium erupted in applause. Someone started playing La Vie en Rose on the sound system, the song Eleanor had mentioned in her lecture as the soundtrack of that summer of 1965. As William and Eleanor swayed slowly, lost in their own world, James pulled Sarah close. "I think we just witnessed the power of words finally spoken," he whispered in her ear. Sarah nodded, realizing that some love stories need time to be written, while others are just beginning their first chapters. News of the epic reunion at Blackwell spread quickly through the Oxford Literary Festival. Eleanor was invited to modify her schedule, transforming her lecture into a special session on loves that transcend time, with William by her side. Sarah watched from the front row as the couple shared their story, fascinated not only by their romance, but by the way James, seated beside her, recorded every detail in his inseparable notebook. "Planning to write about them?" she whispered. "Actually," he replied without taking his eyes off the notebook, "I'm writing about us." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. In the past few days, between organizing the trip and caring for William, they had barely had time to process what was happening between them. After the session, while William and Eleanor walked through the university gardens reminiscing about old times, James invited Sarah for coffee at Blackwell's itself. "You know," he began, absently stirring his cappuccino, "when you found those letters, I thought you were just another nosy volunteer." He smiled at Sarah's indignant expression. "But then I realized you were much more. You didn't just discover the letters. You restored my grandfather's hope." "James, wait. Let me finish." He picked up his notebook. "I've been trying to write my next book for months. Nothing felt right." But now he slid the notebook to her. Sarah opened it to the first page, where a single sentence was written: "To the girl who believed it was never too late for a love story." "Is this a dedication?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Only if you want it to be." James leaned across the table, his eyes meeting hers. "Sarah, in the past few days, you've taught me more about love and courage than all the books I've ever read. And I read a lot," he joked, trying to ease the moment's tension. Sarah laughed, but her hands trembled as she held the notebook. "So I'm your literary muse now?" "You're much more than that." James took her hands in his. "You're the beginning of a story I very much want to write, together with you." Before Sarah could respond, they were interrupted by laughter from the cafe entrance. William and Eleanor walked in hand, looking decades younger. "Ah, youth," Eleanor commented with a knowing smile upon seeing James and Sarah's intertwined hands on the table. "William, darling, doesn't it remind you of us in that cafe in Newport?" "With the difference that they won't wait 58 years to say what they feel," William replied, winking at his grandson. Sarah blushed but didn't let go of James's hands. Instead, she turned the notebook's page and took the pen he always carried in his shirt pocket. Under the dedication, she wrote, "Every great love story needs someone who believes in it. I accept being that person." James read the words, and his face lit up. There, surrounded by thousands of books telling love stories through the centuries, they were writing the first chapter of their own story. William and Eleanor watched the scene with knowing smiles, their own hands still intertwined, living proof that true love knows no limits of time or distance. Eleanor's blue bottle, now on the table between them, caught the afternoon sunlight, casting reflections that danced on the surrounding shelves, as if even the books were celebrating that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones we write when we least expect them. What did you think of this story of timeless love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. Every like and subscription means the world to me. See you in our next emotional journey.